Okay, well, this chapter is on learning. I think what we're going to learn is that there are a variety of different types of learning. Um, the three that we're going to focus most on are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and cognitive and social learning. Learning itself is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from experience. In other words, in how you define relatively permanent, I think is up to interpretation. But it's some sort of change in behavior from experiences that isn't that at least sticks around for a while. The first one we're going to talk about is classical conditioning. Some examples of this. So if you're in the dentist's office and you hear a dentist drill, or even if you're not in the dentist's office, you start getting sweaty, or nervous. If you just see, a significant other and you start feeling kind of the warm fuzzies, maybe you smell a certain beverage and you feel nauseous, or a certain food because you had gotten sick off it before, or maybe there's a ruffling of some paper or a can opening and your cat comes running. This is the type of kind of learning, classical conditioning learning. So, how does this happen? Well, let me kind of go over some of the terminology for you. This is sometimes called, Pavlov's conditioning, because it was accidentally discovered by the great Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. And he was studying digestion in dogs, and he used to, present them meat powder and measure their salivation. And then all of a sudden he realized that the dogs would oftentimes begin salivating even before food was present when he put them in the experimental chamber. He was asking himself, why is this happening? There must be some association between this experimental chamber and the dog's feeding. And so he came up with these, in a sense, terms to describe what was going on. And let me kind of define those to you, and then we'll kind of talk about it a little bit further. He said there's oftentimes something called an unconditioned stimulus, and that results in a unconditioned response. So something like food, right, is an unconditioned stimulus for salivation. You eat food and you salivate. Sometimes neutral stimuli kind of that occur at the same time as the unconditioned stimulus become conditioned. They act like this unconditioned stimulus. And they also can produce a similar response. So in Pavlov's example, it was the harness, say. So that neutral harness would never result in salivation, except that it was paired in time with food. And so then now the harness in and of itself, apart from food, produced salivation. So again, let's sort of look at Pavlov's experiments, and again, this will help us to understand what is happening with classical conditioning. First of all, we know that food produces salivation. We would demonstrate that. This is a reflexive response. Then maybe we'll take a tone or a bell, and we'll sound the tone and demonstrate that it produces no response, so the dog doesn't salivate. Then in phase 2 of the experiment, we repeatedly pair the tone with food as we're giving it to the dog. This is called the acquisition stage. So this goes on for a number of trials. Then in phase 3, what we do is we just use the tone and see what happens. No food. And the tone itself will then elicit the salivation. It's now become a conditioned response, a conditioned stimulus which yields a conditioned response. And this is an example of how you would test classical conditioning and an example of classical conditioning. So can you condition salivation? Absolutely. I've done it in the classroom a million times, where I've given my students pixie sticks, and we used a random word, and every time I'd say the word, they would take a little, eat a little of the pixie stick, which made them salivate, and then afterwards I'd say the word and they would salivate. So you definitely can do it, and it can be fun. You can do it with your friends. Now there's a different, the question is, what is the relationship temporally between the CS and the US? Well, you can do delayed conditioning where the CS occurs before and during. You can do trace conditioning where the CS ends before presentation of the US. You can do backward conditioning where the US comes before, they're followed by the CS, simultaneous conditioning. Many of these will actually yield some effect, but the strongest effect is when the conditioned stimulus ends just before presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. This is when you're going to see the strongest kind of conditioning effect. And classical conditioning really, I think, is responsible for many different things. The conditioned emotional responses we may experience, maybe if you see a police car, you automatically begin to sweat because you've gotten tickets before. There was a case of a little Albert where they classically conditioned a phobia to I think it was like a little furry bunny that he was playing with or something that he liked by scaring him while he played with it. There's this notion of biological preparedness. There does seem to be certain things that we are biologically prepared in a sense to develop a conditioned emotional response to, like heights and waters and animals and some things that might provide a threat for us. And there's kind of contra-preparedness. It's harder to develop phobias or conditioned emotional responses to certain things. Easy with the snake, hard with the car door. Not impossible though, you can do it. Now what happens is, classical conditioning goes through an extinction, renewal, and a spontaneous recovery stage. So after you acquire the conditioned response, if you stop pairing for example, the tone in this case, with the food, over time it will extinguish. You'll stop getting salivation after a number of trials. But what's interesting about it is that if you have a rest period and then you sound the tone the next day or the day after that, after it was fully extinguished, you will see a spontaneous recovery of the salivation again, and then again you have to extinguish it. So it's interesting. It seems to have disappeared, and then it spontaneously recovers again. There are concepts of stimulus generalization and discrimination. So let's say I have an emotional reaction to a snake. Well, if I also have a negative emotional reaction to this rope here that's kind of wound to look like a snake, you would say I have stimulus generalization. I've generalized in a sense, from the snake to the rope. If I don't, then you have stimulus discrimination. If the rope doesn't do anything for me, then you say you're stimulus discrimination. And it can get kind of complicated. I mean, I think you can sometimes do this higher order conditioning where you have the tone creating salivation, and then all of a sudden you take the tone and you pair it with another neutral stimulus like a light or something, and then eventually the light can actually elicit the conditioned response as well. We have a lot of not so much classical conditioning, but we also learn a lot just simply by making associations. So we organisms make connections between stimuli all the time. And this is another kind of associative learning. We tend to associate mom with nurturing, or money with happiness, or whatever. As far as classical conditioning is concerned, we know that the information has to be registered in the brain. The amygdala, which tends to be associated with emotions, is involved. The hippocampus, which is association with stored memories, is involved. And that there are somehow sets of neurons that become linked together, at least temporarily. This is probably what's going on in the brain. Again, I mean, classical conditioning is really pretty ubiquitous. You see it in drug overdoses, conditioned compensatory responses, smoking. A lot of things in the environment, will trigger smoking cravings. They use it in therapy. They certainly use it in advertising, the sex appeal. You see it sometimes in anticipatory nausea before chemotherapy. If you have food poisoning, if you see those foods again, you'll probably start to feel sick, at least for a while. Sometimes, you even see the immune system respond to if the hospital becomes classically conditioned to something like chemotherapy. It's just fascinating. All of this kind of happens reflexively, though we don't have control over it. The other kind of learning is called operant learning, and then we'll get to cognitive and social. But and let me give you some examples and then describe it. But so, let's say your child has some tantrums. You punish your child with fewer tantrums. Let's say the tantrums are kind of brings your child a lot of attention that you've been busy and not giving him attention. Sometimes you get more tantrums. If you find people who has a slot machine that pays out and they're gambling more, an example of operant conditioning. Or if you reward your dog for sitting, the dog's more likely to sit and the next time. Again, operant conditioning. So again, how does this happen? Well, let me give you some of the early experiments to kind of describe it. And the big name associated with this is Skinner and his operant conditioning paradigm. But Skinner would train animals, mice and pigeons, to hit little bars to get food. And sometimes they would have to discriminate. So a green light is on. If you hit the bar, you get food. A red light, you don't. And he studied, by changing the various kind of sounds and lights, and learned about discriminative stimuli and the types of reinforcement that would make an animal respond fast or slow or keep going even when you stop reinforcing them. And so he really taught us a lot about learning. So here's B.F. Skinner. You probably remember him maybe from the very first lecture where my prior students were claiming that his head looked like a triangle. Again, that's B.F. Skinner. So what's happening in operant conditioning? Well, this really looks at the basic relationships between some sort of stimulus and then the response and then the consequences. And the consequences increase or decrease the likelihood that we're going to see this response again. The stimulus oftentimes indicates under what circumstances we may see reinforcement or punishment. And again, some consequences are going to increase behavior, some are going to decrease behavior, whether we experience them as reinforcing or punishing. Sometimes they'll only occur following a specific response, the stimulus, response, contingency. And again, the stimuli may indicate whether we're going to have the consequence at all, discriminative stimuli. So again, these are just some terms you want to familiarize yourself with. And then there's different types of, and this is what really trips up a lot of students, different types of reinforcement. You may have to study these a little bit more on your own, but there's something called positive reinforcement. So when a behavior is increased because it's followed by a rewarding stimulus. So I give my girlfriend a compliment, she gives me a kiss, I begin to give more compliments because the compliments are increased following the rewarding stimulus, which is a kiss. Negative reinforcement. A behavior is increased because a negative stimulus is removed. Okay, so now, here's an example. So you're nagging your roommate to clean. When your roommate finally gets around to cleaning, you stop nagging them. Then your roommate cleans more in the future to avoid nagging. So again, nagging is a stimulus you removed, and the behavior you wanted to increase was cleaning. Positive punishment. A behavior is decreased because it's followed by a negative stimulus. Boss yells at you for arriving late, so you arrive on time. Tardiness is decreased because of the negative stimulus yell. And then negative punishment, behavior is decreased because a rewarding stimulus is removed. So a boyfriend or girlfriend won't kiss you because you smoke, so you begin to smoke less. The behavior that's decreased is smoking because the rewarding stimulus of kissing is removed. Again, it may make sense now, but it's easy to get it confused, so definitely study these in your notes. Again, same concepts as sort of as with classical conditioning. Animals learn to generalize stimuli. if I respond for reinforcement to a green light, and then I'm shown a blue light, and I respond to that, and I've generalized. If I don't, I've discriminated. After a while of not getting rewarded for something, the behavior extinguishes. But after a little while, it spontaneously recovers again. And it's interesting, this is a little picture of rat basketball, but Skinner demonstrated through shaping that he could really, and through this concept of successive approximations, reinforce animals to engage in all kinds of crazy behaviors by simply shaping it using reinforcement and stimuli. So again, I think I have some examples of these videos to look at. You definitely check them out. The other thing that we learned is that the type of reinforcement that we give people influences how long they'll continue to respond and how quickly. So after continuous reinforcement, is good, but sometimes it's hard to continuously reinforce an animal. And, if it's with food or something, you probably they're going to get full. So they use a lot of these partial reinforcement schedules. One, and I'll go through this. Sometimes they're intervals and sometimes they're ratio. Now, an interval means that you reinforce them after a certain amount of time has passed. The ratio means that you reinforce them after a certain number of responses, like hitting pecking or something like that. Fixed means that the interval is always the same. Variable means that it varies. So it could be average, of 2 minutes, but the interval could be 3 minutes or 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes, and it switches up. Same thing, ratio. Fixed ratio is when you reward an animal after a fixed number of responses. Could be 15, 10, something like that. Variable ratio is when it's variable. So sometimes they get rewarded with 2 or 10 or 20 or 15 or 8. What we found is that animals respond fastest to the ratio schedules, and that's because they can earn reward faster than they could with the interval schedules. And also we've learned that animals will quit responding after they don't receive a reward much more quickly in the fixed interval or ratio, and that's because they figure out they're not getting reinforced. So if you wanted something that was the fastest responding and the most resistant to extinction, you would probably go with something like a variable ratio, because they would respond fast because it's a ratio and they can earn rewards faster. But because it's variable, they will continue or they will persist because you're not sure if this is just a long, if they have to go a long time without getting rewarded. If you kind of compare the two, classical and operant, again, classical is this learned association, and operant is more, you're responding, you have control over that, in response to reinforcement. So they say that classical conditioning is passive because the animal doesn't have to really do anything. And operant condition, it's more active. Or again, they use this term, the responses are elicited by the stimuli versus emitted in operant conditioning. And they share a lot of the features, as I mentioned: extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. Now quickly, another real powerful way in which we learn: cognitive and social learning. They've learned that there's this kind of insight learning, that humans and animals can have these kind of aha experiences that we can, in a sense, problem solve. Sultan the chimp is one that that he learned to problem solve to get treats and food. And so one type of cognitive learning is this kind of insight learning that kind of goes on in our own heads as we try to solve problems. And another powerful way of learning is observational learning, and that's just watching others. Albert Bandura came up with social learning theory, and he said, models where we watch people, and that's how we learn. He did these great studies, Bobo Vidal studies, where some kids would see a model being nice to this little blow-up doll, or being mean to it. And without being reinforced or punished or anything, the children would just learn these behaviors. And so they saw someone do it, and they would go do it. I mean, we've all had this experience where watching is a very, very powerful way to learn. And maybe even one of the most powerful ways to learn. This brings up issues about if we do those things that we see, then what should we be worried about what we see? If we see a lot of violence or sex, 50% of the programs on TV have violence. 73% of the TV programs where there's violence, the perpetrators receive no punishment. There's no harm to the victim in almost half the violent interactions. They get up. Victims show no pain. They rarely show nonviolent solutions. There's tons of video games. I mean, what do we expect if we do what we see? And this is what we're learning through observation. And I think there's some evidence, that this can be really problematic, especially for young children. So that's it for now. And look over your notes and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks. Bye.